Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am here to talk about our automation journey with Temporal, how Temporal has solved countless issues and focus on what matters most. And first, I would like to apologize because I'm not in my best condition today, so you can probably hear it in my voice, so I'll be drinking a lot of water throughout. Okay, so I am Sonia De La Rosa. I am originally from Indonesia, but I moved to Amsterdam around 6 years ago. And previously, I worked at Bank, which is the second biggest neobank in Europe. But now I work at Mollie as a backend software engineer. And Mollie, some of you might know or maybe not, so I will briefly talk about it. So Mollie is a financial services provider that offers a wide range of payment-related products, such as online payments, in-person payments, invoicing, but also capital lending and a few other products. And we serve over 200,000 businesses across Europe. And yeah, so just like any other companies, Mollie, we are divided internally into different departments. But here I am here on behalf of the onboarding department at Mollie. So what does it mean? Well, we are responsible to make sure that merchants have a smooth sign-up experience. So we're responsible for mostly new customers, and we do what we call a KYC. So this is a common term used in the industry. It just means know your customer. It just means that we have to collect and verify the details of our customers to make sure that we are compliant with the rules of law and that we are not, for example, onboarding fraudulent customers or scammers. So I am here to talk about our journey. So let's start with the beginning before we adopted Temporal. So a few years ago, I think some of you might remember there was this thing called a pandemic. It happened everywhere, and it made a lot of restrictions in terms of in-person shopping, right? A lot of businesses had to close their shops, and they had to shift to online payments, online shopping. And Mollie, we also offer online payments. So that means that we had a massive growth. We had a lot of people signing up with us. And it's not just from the markets that we serve at the time, because we were at the time serving mostly only the Dutch market and maybe surrounding markets like Belgium and German. But we also had people signing up from different countries all over Europe. And even though we were actually already able to serve our customers there, we were not exactly suited for that, because we would have to make changes that make it so that we can adapt to the market needs of those countries as well. And well, it's good for the company, of course, that we had such a big growth. As developers, we needed to make the changes to adapt to those needs. And unfortunately, at the time, our system was based in a PHP monolith. And yeah, that led to a lot of issues, actually, because we had a long lead time for new markets, because every time you need to make a new change, you have to go all over the code base. You need to know what this does, what that does. You have to find exactly what you need to do there. And yeah, just because of that, it was very difficult to make changes, and it's very difficult to ship new features. And because of that, we also provided a suboptimal experience for our customers, because we were not able to make the changes in time for those new merchants, new customers from the new markets. And on top of that, we also had difficulty proving compliance during audits, because sometimes we even had times where we had to show the code during the audit to show that we were doing what we were supposed to do, because I guess someone forgot to log it, so we couldn't just show the audit logs. And yeah, so we had a lot of problems, and we knew that a change was needed. So that's why we decided that we needed to modernize the systems. And we decided that at some point, we wanted to decouple our system from the big PHP monolith into smaller services that are orchestrated by Temporal. And we wanted to have different services because we want to be able to decouple the responsibilities that we have within onboarding into smaller services to make changes a bit easier, so they're not too, related to each other. And yeah, so in the end, we decided to look into existing tooling in the market to see what would suit our use case the best. And spoiler alert, we chose Temporal. And that's why we decided to use Temporal as the orchestrator of our distributed systems. And right now we have decided that, but we wanted to start simple with Temporal. We don't want to just jump into modernizing the systems and just rebuilding our entire architecture with Temporal. So we were looking for something small to start with. And thankfully, there was actually one exact thing that we had to do at the time that was perfect. So our first use case was very simple. So for a subset of low-risk customers that we have at Mollie, we actually let them process payments even before they complete the onboarding process. So even though they have only provided a subset of information and not everything, we let them to already create and receive payments, but just not settle their balance. So that, yeah, because we want them to be able to test their payments on their website as soon as possible. But we added a new requirement that asks them to complete the onboarding process within 90 days, or we will block their payments and we'll block their account, basically. And yeah, so this was the first use case. So let's look at how we would build this without Temporal in our legacy system. Oh wait, before we talk about that, let's talk about this first. So it's a very simple process, but let's talk about how it looks in a flowchart. Because yeah, we want to make sure that we are talking, like we have the same understanding, because this is something that we do at Mollie actually. As engineers, we like to draw out the process first to make sure that what we're talking about is the same thing as the product people are talking about or the operational teams. We want to make sure that we are all within the same understanding. So it's a very simple process. The timer starts when the customer receives their first payment. And then we have a 90-day time limit until we check whether they have completed their onboarding process. And if not, we disable their payments, right? That's very simple. And maybe to improve the user experience a bit, we want to send a bit of reminders in between. And now, let's look at how we would build this in the legacy system. Well, we probably would have to introduce some kind of new table to store the information of which customers we need to block. We need to store the ID, the starting date of the 90-day timeline, how many days, or which days we would like to send a reminder to. And then if we want some soft deletion feature, we need to add that in as well. And then we also need to have a cron job that would read into this table and would have some complex query to see which merchants would need to be acted on today and what act. Do we need to block it? Do we need to send a reminder? Or, yeah, a different query, but they're all going to be complex. And we also would need to maintain the cron job. And it just seems like a lot of work, a very complex system to build for such a simple process. So we were lucky because around this time was when we already decided we wanted to use Temporal. So we were like, okay, why not use Temporal? So let's see how we would build this with Temporal. Well, we can just go back to the flowchart. And you probably can guess it. We can just turn the entire process into a workflow. So each action in this business process can be turned into an activity within the workflow for this disabling payments process. And I think this is a very dramatic difference from before because the flowchart and the implementation before looked very different, but now it's basically the same. So I think if we are able to write our workflow code in a way that maps the actual business process effectively, then we can probably make sure that what we're implementing is actually going to fit the requirements perfectly. So if we turn that into code, into workflow code, I'm going to apologize here again because I'm going to make you look at some PHP code and not Java. But yes, it's very easy, don't worry. So this is the class. And we have a workflow method in the workflow class. And within the workflow method, we will have an await command from the Temporal SDK with a timeout of 90 days, right? Or if the customer has completed onboarding. And this is going to be stored as a workflow variable, which can be updated with a workflow signal method. And then after the timer concludes, of course, we check again if they have completed onboarding or not, and if not, we disabled it payments. It's very simple. And yeah, so this is what we have implemented as the first version of the workflow. Very simple, it matches the requirements exactly. And then we start expanding on this workflow, and then as it usually goes, you're familiar with this, we had more and more feature requests coming in, and we actually expanded. We started with this workflow, and we ended up with this. So this is an actual footage taken from our code base. It had this really massive workflow method, around 160 lines, I think, which made the workflow really difficult to read. And I think it defeats the purpose of why we chose Temporal to begin with. So then it led us to the question, how do we write workflow code efficiently? And around the same time, we were also dealing with an issue in which we needed this workflow to be started for a certain number of customers in the middle of the workflow. So what I mean by that is, if we go back to the flowchart again, so the first payment is the start of the timeline, right? But we had a few customers in which we need the workflow to start in the middle. So we don't want the actions before that to be taken, but just the actions after. So for example, if we have customer A, whose payment days was actually 35 days ago, and we need the workflow to start now, we want to skip the first reminder, but still send the second one, and then disable the payments, I guess, 55 days from now. And that's why we decided to kill two birds with one stone, because we wanted to rewrite the workflow in a way that it would be easily readable, but we also wanted to introduce this new feature because this was not something that was supported in the first version of the workflow we wrote, because yeah, it would just run for 90 days and there's no way you can just skip any activities. So we started on a project to rewrite the workflow, and it was a pretty fun one, actually. What we did is we looked into the code samples of the SDK, and this one is taken from the PHP one, but it also exists in the Java one, and also I think in other languages as well. So it has a main workflow method, main method called sleep until, which takes as input the wake up time. So when the timer needs to fire. And first we set it as the variable of the object. And then we do a little bit of math to calculate what is the actual interval of the sleep that we need by subtracting it with the current timestamp. And then we use the await command again to sleep for that interval, or if the timer gets updated, because it's called the updatable timer. And this is a variable that is initially set as false. And we also need to wrap it in a loop, of course, because in case the timer does get updated, our await will conclude, and then we need to restart the timer. But if it does actually run until the timeout, then we need to break out of the loop. And then, of course, this wake up time and update is something that can be updated with a different method. So it's quite simple. It's the updatable timer. So what we did with this object is we took inspiration from it, and in the main method of this timer, we simply added returns to the method. So we made it such that when we calculate for the sleep interval for the time at which we need to sleep, if the value is negative, we return a false value. But if the value is positive, we continue. We do the await with timeout, and then if it does timeout, we return a true value. So let's look at how we actually were able to use this object in our workflow method. So this is the new workflow method that we rewrote. First, we had some initial actions, let's say to set some variables or something. And then we have a set of reminders that we need to send in the workflow. And for each reminder, we calculate the date to send it. And then we use our timer object from the previous slide and supply the reminder date. And then we send the email on that date. So if we use a real example, let's say, let's take the customer A from earlier, whose first payment date was 35 days ago. And the first reminder, again, is on day 30, and the start date is 35 days ago. So if we do the math, the reminder date is supposed to be 5 days ago. The first reminder was meant to be sent 5 days ago. And then if we supply that to our timer, if you remember, this would result in a negative sleep interval. So then we would actually receive a false value here in terms of our timer. And because we wrap this email activity within the if statement, then the email actually gets skipped. We actually don't send the first email. And then if you take the next reminder, which is on day 60, if we do the math again, we actually get 25 days from now in the future. So that would actually result in a positive sleep interval, which means that when we pass this value into the timer that we have, we actually would get into the await command from earlier. And then in the end, after the timeout, we return true here with the timer. And then it would go into the if statement, which means that we will send the email, the second email. So I find it so amazing that such small changes in the object that we made earlier can result in fulfilling a pretty complex requirement. And I think it's a great demonstration of fault tolerance that you can achieve with Temporal. Because, yeah, let's say, I don't know, knock on wood, that we lose all our workflow history and workflow events and everything. But then if we have the customers that we need to block and also their first payment date, we can just apply it and then it will function as normally. So in the end, we rewrote our workflow, and this is what it ended up looking like, sort of. It's not an exact copy, but it's pretty similar. It had, I think, around 26 lines compared to 160 from earlier. And yeah, I think it's really nice to be able to see that it reflects the actual process because, yeah, if you rewrote the variable naming a bit, I think it probably would just look like regular English. So we had quite a few key learnings, of course, from this first workflow implementation. But I think the biggest win was definitely discovering how closely we could map our business logic to actual workflow code. Because, yeah, there was almost a one-to-one match between what the business needs and how we can write it in code. So after a few smaller initial projects, we decided to finally move with the modernization effort of our systems. So that's when we moved to the period of after the adoption of Temporal. One second. So if we go back to our, so what we talked about earlier, the onboarding department at Mollie, we had been working really hard to revamp our systems, and we can summarize that into a few core objectives. So the first one, we would like to have a faster time to market for new features because we want to be able to ship quickly. And we also want to be able to be flexible to changing requirements in case we need to launch to new markets. And we also want to make sure that the new system is easily auditable. And those are the three main objectives. And based on that, we designed, and then, yeah, of course, we also decided to modernize our system into a distributed set of services in Java. So why did we decide to move to Java? Well, because probably reasons that you're already aware as well. The technical strength of Java, for example, because in terms of performance for memory management or long-running processes, of course, Java is always performing better than PHP. And also because the libraries in Java are better supported than PHP, but also because since a few years ago, I think, we've had more and more Java developers joining Mollie. So we had an internal community of Java that was continuing to grow. So it made sense to make the switch to Java. And yeah, with that in mind, this is what the new architecture that we wanted to look like. So at the top here, we have the clients of our system, which would be the web dashboard for Mollie. Or we also have a mobile app, or we also, of course, have public APIs. And we want these clients to talk through an API gateway to our main service, which we call the cool service. And that is the real name. Not because we wanted it to be cool, but it is short for customer, onboarding, operations, and lifecycle. Cool. Yeah, and then this main service, which would be the orchestrator. And this is the one with the direct connection to the namespaces on our Temporal cloud. And that means that's where we want most of our workflow code to live in. And then we also have our family of specialized services. Like I mentioned earlier, each one would have a different responsibility than the others. So for example, it could be, I don't know, a web crawler or a service to fetch documents or something like that. And this is what we are aiming for. And I guess the question is, how do we get there, right? Where do we start? So we want our system, our new system, to be centered around workflows. So for that reason, we actually would like to start with designing the workflow architecture. And from there, we would like to know so once we have the workflows in mind, then we can know what activities are needed for each workflow. And once we do that, then we will be able to abstract existing functionality into APIs and events. And then we can use this as the building blocks to actually write and run our workflows. And once we have verified that it does work as we expect it to, then we can already migrate the functionalities from the existing systems, the legacy systems, into the new specialized services that we have designed. And in the end, we can then migrate the data from the legacy monolith into the new system. Because there's so much tight coupling, of course, there in monolith, this is going to be the last thing that we do because it just takes a lot of time and effort. And now let's go into the first step. So how do we design our workflows? Well, we want to leverage Temporal's ability to help us map the business process to code, right? So within the onboarding department, the source, the root of most of our functional requirements are actually from our customer due diligence or CDD policy. This is where we say which merchants can be onboarded, how they can be onboarded, and what we need to do to get them onboarded. And in this document, there's actually 6 main groups of requirements that we have. It's pretty straightforward. So as a financial services provider, we have to make sure that the customer signing up with us is a legitimate business, of course, and we also need to know who exactly is signing up with us. So we need to verify their identity. And once we have verified that, we need to make sure that they are legally authorized to actually represent that business that they say they are a part of. And we need to make sure that their activities are also acceptable within our risk policy, and that they're not subject to any sanctions list by, I don't know, the EU or something. And that the bank account that they would like to use for settlements do belong to them. So what we did is that we used this main group of requirements and we turned each one of these into a workflow. So each verification process is a workflow on its own. And we have these as the child workflows of an overarching onboarding workflow. And because some of these verifications also have sub-requirements and sub-processes, then we have them again as the child workflows of each verification workflow. And sometimes there's a bit of dependencies as well between the workflow. So we communicate between each workflow through either a signal or an update. And we decided to go with child workflows because we want to have one single common root, because they're all basically rooted in one customer. So in case, for example, we need to reject a customer because their business activities are not acceptable, then we can just close the parent workflow and then have everything just terminated. So let's actually zoom in to one of the verification workflow as an example. And let's take, for example, an easy one, the identity verification workflow. At the highest level, it looks quite simple. First, we ask the customer to upload an identity document that they have. Then we actually use a third-party supplier to verify that this document is valid and legitimate. And once we know that it is valid, we perform a set of internal verifications. We have some rules to make sure that they're acceptable. And then we have an outcome of whether this identity has been verified on the user, on the customer or not. And if we turn this into a workflow, well, you guessed it, it's very straightforward. It's the same process. We have the customer upload the ID, and we communicate that through a workflow update to our workflow. And then we can progress into sending the data to the supplier. And usually it takes a few minutes, so then we have to wait until the supplier gets back to us. And then when we have that, we can proceed with the workflow, and then we can perform our internal verifications. And then we have the outcome as either the output of the workflow or as a state that is queryable. And so these activities in the workflow is something that we already have in the monolith, right? It's not, we have been doing this for years, so of course they exist there. So that means that from our workflow, we can simply just build APIs in the monolith and communicate from the workflow to the monolith with the APIs. And then once we have this workflow up and running in production, and we can verify that it does work as we expect it to, what we can do is we can simply build the same API endpoints here in the yellow arrows and move them to our specialized services. And we can then, once we do that, we can just swap out the activity from using the old monolith connection to the new services. And that's it. That's how we migrate one business process from the monolith to the new service, the new system. And we did this for every single business process that we have. And yeah, that's how we managed to get closer to the new architecture that we want. So other than that, what else did we achieve from doing this work? Well, we are very happy to have the workflow history because we are able to use it as a technical audit trail, because now we have a centralized place where we could see everything that has happened in the process for a single customer. And because of the way we write the workflows and the activities, it's also readable for non-engineers and not just engineers, which is really good. So you can tell your PM, hey, it's done. And then, of course, you can also use it as a debugging thing because you can see all the input and output of each activity, and you can tell exactly why, for example, a customer is stuck, or if something went wrong, you can see everything in the workflow history. And other than that, what else did we achieve? Well, we can also have a seamless transition into automating our workflows, because now that we have every single business process mapped into a workflow, we can easily replace the manual tasks where we need to with automation to improve the efficiency of our processes. We can do that, for example, through workflow versioning or just simply changing the way the workflow behaves a bit. But you know exactly where to do it. So if we revisit our core objectives from earlier, we have 3. The first one, is it faster now for the time to market for new features? Yes, because with the workflows mirroring exactly the business process, the requirements would be to change the business process. That means you can just go to that workflow and do your changes there. You don't have to be scared of going through thousands of source code just to see where to make the changes. You also don't have to be scared of rippling effect from making changes, because each workflow has its own separate responsibility. And is it flexible to changing requirements? Also, because now that it's a workflow, you can just adjust the way the workflow behaves based on, you can introduce a new parameter to your workflow inputs and adjust the behavior based on that, for example. And lastly, is it auditable? Well, yes, of course, as I mentioned 2 slides ago, and not just for engineers, but also for non-engineers. So in summary, Temporal has been very key in our journey to modernize our systems. And it was definitely a big learning curve because we had to get used to, for example, workflow versioning. We needed to know how to write workflow code efficiently. And there were also many other things that we had to learn how to use, how to leverage from Temporal. But it has been very instrumental in our journey to a new modernized architecture. And I'm not just speaking on behalf of engineers, but we have been very happy with Temporal. And also, from product people at the company, because it has helped us to focus on what matters most, which is to ship new features. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we have time for about one, maybe two questions. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay, let's get the mic to you. So we always ask questions into the mic. Otherwise, no one can hear them.
One thing I've heard from Temporal users is that you get all these nice features, but then you're writing a new paradigm. So what has your experience been like? What challenges have you run into?
I think workload versioning is definitely one of them because even though we are quite new with Temporal, there's still constantly a stream of requirements that we need to implement. And then we have to deal with so many versioning in one workflow. And that's just definitely not something that we were used to. And you have different branches in the workflows. And I guess at some point we would have to decide whether we should rewrite the entire workflow and have the new version in one place or not. And just that kind of discussion is definitely something new for us.
Okay, so one over here. We'll get you, and then you. We'll get two more. You, and then you.
Thanks for that. That was really, really good. With the mapping of the business processes to make them really easily translatable into Temporal, do you have any tips for how you sort of document the business processes so that it works with Temporal?
Yeah, so what we're trying to look for is to kind of have it automated, which would be nice because it does map the business process exactly, but that's not something we were able to be successful with yet. So yeah, I don't really have any specific tips yet for that, unfortunately.
Hi. Question less about Temporal and more about the journey at Mollie. So as you're evolving your architecture, how have you navigated, or have you had to navigate any trade-offs between availability and consistency? For example, maybe there was something you could do in your monolith atomically, but now you want to separate that across two teams. Have you had to navigate any of those challenges, and what's been your general strategy?
I think so far, not that much yet, because one nice thing about the onboarding part in Mollie is that most of the process we have is kind of async. So there's not like really strict high requirements. So we are kind of fortunate in that regards. So yeah, not that much so far.
Okay, well, thank you again. Let's give everyone a round of applause.